The planet was written off without a cry, without war. The Council tallied the numbers, closed the file, and deemed 300 million lives an acceptable loss. When the sky above Kharos Minor began peeling away from the world, no one expected help. Rational species do not risk fleets for the doomed. And then they came. Not warships, not an invasion fleet. Overloaded civilian ships, screeching, shivering along their seams, packed with people, water, and fear. The pirates laughed. Then the hulls of those lifeboats shifted, flexed, and revealed themselves, and the galaxy understood too late. Humanity never sends mercy unarmed. This is the story of how humans turned lifeboats into a front line and proved that the deadliest weapon in the universe is refusing to abandon anyone. Alarms echoed through the upper atmosphere long before they reached the ground, a distant metallic howl carried by thinning air that tasted of rust and ozone. Above Kharos Minor, the sky had begun to bruise, its once stable blue fading into streaks of ash and violet as atmospheric layers sheared away like skin torn from muscle. Satellites tumbled in widening arcs, their hulls screaming as friction bit into them for the last time. On the surface, the ground trembled with a low, arrhythmic pulse, the dying heartbeat of a world whose core no longer held its shape. Kharos Minor had once occupied a forgettable line in the archives of the Perseid Coalition, categorized as marginally habitable and strategically irrelevant. Its gravity sat within tolerable limits, its seas were shallow but drinkable, and its skies had supported life without complaint. Over generations, cities grew in patient defiance of mediocrity. Families built routines around predictable suns and seasons. Children learned the taste of local dust and the sound of wind scraping stone. All of it rested on an orbit that slowly, imperceptibly, began to fail. The decay did not announce itself with drama. It crept in through misaligned tides, through heat blooms beneath the crust, through weather systems that refused to obey old calendars. Scientists flagged anomalies. Engineers reinforced structures. Governments reassured populations with statistics and projections. Far above them, coalition analysts watch probability curves bend downward and never recover. Simulations multiplied. Resource forecasts collapsed. Evacuation models consumed fleets, fuel, and decades that the coalition had already allocated elsewhere. The decision emerged without anger or regret. It arrived as a conclusion, clean and bloodless, expressed through numbers and efficiency metrics. The cost of saving Kharos Minor exceeded the value assigned to its continuation. The planet was redesignated as terminal. Its 300 million inhabitants were reclassified from citizens to losses, their lives converted into data points that balanced ledgers and stabilized long-term projections. The process was flawless. The logic was airtight. When the abandonment decree transmitted, it carried ceremonial gravity, but no warmth. Coalition seals burned briefly across encrypted channels, accompanied by hymns of procedural finality. Orbital authorities received instructions to wind down operations. Trade corridors were rerouted. Insurance claims were preemptively denied. The bureaucracy moved on with practiced ease, already reallocating attention towards systems with higher yield and lower risk. On Kharos Minor, the decree manifested as silence. Support ships failed to arrive. Supply schedules slipped and then vanished. The sky grew thinner by the day, letting radiation bleed into homes and lungs. People wrapped scarves tighter, sealed cracks, and continued to wake at the same hours, clinging to habit as gravity weakened beneath their feet. Above them stretched an uncaring infinity, vast and cold, where a rational galaxy had already written their ending and turned the page. The message spread without sound, riding tight beam relays and quantum couriers, a silent ripple across the Perseid sector that left dread in its wake. On distant worlds, indicator lights shifted from amber to red, and long-established protocols activated with mechanical precision. Border beacons flared and hardened, their energy fields thickening like scar tissue as neighboring empires sealed transit lanes. Navigation charts updated themselves, drawing invisible walls through vacuum where ships were no longer welcome. The smell of ozone filled command chambers as reactors adjusted output, preparing for isolation rather than aid. Merchant guilds responded within minutes. Cargo captains felt the shift first, a tightening in their chests as insurance algorithms recalculated risk tolerances. Contracts dissolved mid-transmission. Freight lanes that had fed Kharos Minor for generations vanished from registries. Warehouses redirected shipments toward safer markets, their automated cranes humming with indifferent efficiency. In counting halls lit by cold white panels, trade clerks watched projected losses stabilize and felt relief, the quiet comfort of solvency achieved at the expense of strangers they would never meet. Far from these sterile rooms, pirate flotillas stirred. In shadowed docking rings and drifting asteroid warrens, engines warmed and hulls groaned awake. Crews sharpened tools and checked weapon seals, tasting opportunity in recycled air heavy with oil and sweat. Desperation, they knew, always ripened before extinction. Evacuation rumors, black market transport, abandoned convoys, all promised profit. Kharos Minor became a whispered coordinate, spoken with hunger rather than pity, a dying light marked for stripping before it went dark forever. Above the doomed world, orbital infrastructure began its methodical shutdown. Defense grids powered down first, their energy signatures collapsing into nothing as if shame itself had weight. Traffic control arrays dimmed next, guidance beacons blinking out one by one. Station rings that had once glittered with habitation lights fell silent, windows going black in slow sequence. From the surface, it looked as though the stars themselves were closing their eyes. On Kharos Minor, the absence was felt more keenly than any announcement. Supply shuttles failed to arrive. Automated weather warnings ceased mid-cycle. The constant background hum of orbital industry faded until only the wind remained, thin and sharp as it scoured exposed stone. People gathered on rooftops and open plains, wrapped in layers against the cold, staring upward. They searched for contrails, for engine flares, for any sign that someone had disagreed with the verdict written in distant council chambers. The descent into panic was not immediate. It unfolded quietly, almost politely. Markets shortened their hours. Schools combined classrooms to conserve heating. Hospitals dimmed non-essential lighting and rerouted power to life support. Families clung to routine with fierce devotion, brewing the same morning drinks, repairing the same tools, telling the same stories before sleep. Each habit became an act of defiance against the creeping understanding that help was not coming. As atmospheric density continued to drop, breathing grew laborious. The air carried a metallic tang that burned the sinuses and left a bitter film on the tongue. Skin cracked despite layers of protection. Children developed coughs that echoed too loudly in small rooms. Gravity fluctuations caused objects to drift and then slam back into place, rattling nerves already stretched thin. Engineers worked until their hands shook, reinforcing structures that would never be enough, knowing the limits of what could be saved. Religious centers filled, not with cries, but with heavy silence. Faiths long accustomed to cosmic indifference offered no miracle this time. Even prayer felt thin beneath a sky that no longer held. Elsewhere, data terminals flickered as people tried to access coalition channels, refreshing dead links until fingers numbed. Each failed attempt pressed the truth deeper into collective consciousness. The galaxy had made its calculation and moved on. From the Perseid Coalition's perspective, the situation was resolved. Internal reports categorized Kharos Minor as closed, its future trajectory plotted into inevitability. Analysts archived the models and freed processing power for more promising systems. There was no malice in this decision, no hatred. Only the smooth functioning of an empire that valued continuity over compassion, survival over sentiment. Extinction, though regrettable, was orderly. What the coalition did not measure were the small, stubborn reactions playing out beneath a thinning sky. It did not log the way parents adjusted sleep cycles so children would not wake coughing. It did not record the quiet redistribution of food, neighbors slipping rations through sealed doors without expectation of return. It did not account for the way people stood together at night, shoulders touching, sharing warmth while watching stars that seemed farther away than ever before. As days passed, resignation settled like frost. People began to pack what little could be carried, not for escape, but for dignity, preparing for an end they could not outrun. Some wrote messages and stored them in local archives, hoping that someday someone might read them and know they had existed. Others simply sat and listened to the wind, memorizing its sound, grounding themselves in the last sensations their world could offer. Above them all, space remained vast and indifferent, a black ocean dotted with cold fire. No armadas turned back. No relief convoys altered course. To rational species, the logic held. Resources were finite. Choices had to be made. Kharos Minor was a loss already absorbed, a line item closed. Yet in that vastness, far beyond the borders that had snapped shut, something shifted. The announcement that had traveled like a death toll through vacuum continued onward, reaching ears that did not belong to empires or guilds or pirates. It reached a species that had learned, across millennia of suffering and stubborn survival, that acceptable losses were a lie told by those distant enough not to feel them. Metal screamed as space-time released its grip, a tearing shriek that vibrated through vacuum and into sensor arrays across the system. The first human vessel burst into real space like a wounded animal clawing its way out of a storm, its hull scarred with glowing fractures, plates warped and blackened by forces that still clung to it. Ionized gas bled from stressed seams, forming a brief, ghostly halo before dispersing into the cold. Its engines howled, a raw mechanical cry pushed far beyond rated tolerances, thrusters stuttering as they fought gravity that pulled like a closing fist. There was no escort, no martial formation, no ceremonial broadcast or heraldic display. The ship drifted for a breathless moment, stabilizers groaning, then corrected its trajectory and burned hard toward Kharos Minor. External observers flagged the maneuver as reckless. Internal diagnostics screamed warnings in cascading amber and red, calculating hull fatigue, reactor strain, and failure probabilities that climbed into unacceptable ranges. The ship continued regardless, its course unwavering, its intent unmistakable. Then more arrived. They emerged in uneven intervals, each transition leaving ripples in local spacetime, each hull bearing the scars of haste. Freighters refitted in days rather than decades. Passenger liners stripped of ornamentation. Industrial haulers whose cargo bays had never been meant to hold living bodies. Hundreds of human ships poured into the system, engines roaring, heat blooms flaring as they fought decaying orbital dynamics. From a distance, the armada looked chaotic, uncoordinated, a scattering of civilian craft plunging toward a dying world. To the watching empires, it was madness. Traffic control networks attempted to classify the influx and failed. There were too many variables, too many vessels operating outside standard safety envelopes. The ships were overcrowded, mass readings spiking far above certified limits. Life support outputs surged, oxygen recyclers pushed to their edge, heat exchangers glowing as they worked to keep bodies warm in the growing cold. Cargo manifests, intercepted and analyzed, showed holds emptied of commercial goods and filled instead with water bladders, ration bricks, thermal blankets, and medical supplies. Luxury had been torn out to make room for survival. Inside those ships, the air was thick with recycled breath and machine oil. Decks vibrated constantly, a deep, bone-rattling hum that never quite settled. People moved through narrow corridors with practiced care, steadying themselves against bulkheads slick with condensation. Hands gripped railings until knuckles blanched. The smell of antiseptic mixed with sweat and overheated circuitry. Fear was present, sharp and undeniable, but it was folded inward, controlled, made to share space with purpose. Human logistics centers, light years away, processed the same data that alarmed external observers. Models ran and reran, projecting catastrophic loss probabilities. Structural failures under sustained gravitational stress. Engine burnout during repeated high-thrust maneuvers. Cascading life support collapse under maximum load. Each projection ended with casualty estimates that climbed into numbers no strategist wanted to own. The reports were flagged, reviewed, acknowledged. Then the operations continued. The ships pushed deeper into the gravity well, as if drawn by more than mass. Navigational systems adjusted constantly, compensating for orbital decay and shifting debris fields. Pilots fought micro-corrections, muscles tight, eyes burning as they held trajectories that should not have been stable. Automated systems took over where human reflexes could not keep pace, algorithms dancing on the edge of chaos. Every maneuver, shaved years off service lives that no longer mattered. As the fleet closed on Kharos Minor, planetary visuals filled screens across the sector. The world looked wounded, its atmosphere frayed into luminous streamers, auroras burning where shielding once held. Debris from abandoned orbital stations glittered like a graveyard of stars. The human ships did not slow. They threaded through wreckage, shields flaring as fragments scraped and sparked, hulls shuddering under impacts that would have turned profit-driven captains away. Within the ships, small rituals persisted. A technician wiped grease from their hands before adjusting a child's thermal wrap. A medic counted breaths under their own, syncing heart rates with a patient whose pulse fluttered too fast. Someone fixed a loose panel with a strip torn from a uniform, fingers numb but precise. These acts were not logged. They did not appear in any model. They were invisible to the galaxy watching from afar. External analysts began to understand that this was not an evacuation planned in calm rooms with time to spare. It was an improvisation driven by refusal. The human fleet had not waited for permission. It had not petitioned councils or balanced ledgers. It had launched with what it had, when it could, because delay would have meant watching the lights on Kharos Minor go out one by one. As the first ships reached low orbit, gravity tugged harder, pulling at frames already stretched thin. Hull temperatures spiked. Structural members flexed and groaned. Alarms cascaded again, urgent and insistent. Engineers rerouted power, shutting down non-essential systems to feed engines and shields. Comfort vanished entirely, replaced by bare function. The ships held together through stubborn design and constant human intervention, hands and minds compensating where metal threatened to fail. From the surface, the sight was overwhelming. Streaks of fire cut through the bruised sky as human vessels descended, their heat signatures painting the clouds with brief, violent color. For those watching from the ground, the sensation was not immediate hope, but shock. No rational power should have come. No fleet should have risked so much for a world already written off. And yet the ships kept coming, their engines screaming defiance into thinning air. The observing empires recorded the event with a mixture of fascination and disbelief. Strategic councils debated motives. Economists recalculated potential returns and found none. Military analysts noted the lack of escorts, the absence of aggressive posturing, and classified the operation as unsustainable. Pirate bands adjusted intercept vectors, drawn by the density of targets and the apparent lack of protection. Every model agreed on one point. The humans were accepting losses before they had even begun. What those models could not express was the weight carried by each vessel. Not just mass, but intent. The human ships were moving into danger not because they expected to win, but because leaving was unthinkable. They carried within their strained hulls a quiet consensus born of a species that had learned, across countless disasters on a hostile home world, that survival was not always efficient. Sometimes it was simply necessary. As the fleet spread into position around Kharos Minor, engines flaring against the pull of a dying planet, the galaxy watched a line being crossed. It was not marked by weapons fire or declarations of war. It was marked by civilian ships pushing past safety margins into a collapsing gravity well, guided by calculations that acknowledged disaster and moved forward anyway. In that moment, before the first evacuees were loaded and before the first shot would ever be fired, humanity announced itself not with words, but with motion, choosing to fall toward hell rather than orbit safety and regret. Shuttle thrusters thundered against thinning air, their exhaust plumes carving brief, incandescent scars across the sky as they lifted from cracked landing pads and improvised fields. The sound rolled across cities like a storm that never quite arrived, a constant pressure that rattled bones and set teeth on edge. On the ground, dust rose in choking clouds, tasting of metal and burnt stone, clinging to skin and fabric as people ran, stumbled, and were pulled forward by hands that refused to let go. Evacuation had begun, and it moved faster than any model had allowed. Human coordination spread through the chaos like a living thing. There were no shouted commands echoing across plazas, no visible chains of authority. Instead, motion emerged from instinct refined by practice. Lines formed where moments before there had been crowds. Stretchers flowed toward shuttle bays without hesitation. Children were lifted, wrapped, and passed forward with a precision that bordered on ritual. Elders were steadied, their trembling weight shared across many shoulders. The injured were triaged in seconds, not by rank or utility, but by need. To outside observers, it looked irrational, even wasteful. To humans, it was the only order that made sense. Inside the ships, space vanished. Cargo holds became breathing chambers, every cubic meter claimed. Bodies pressed together, warmth shared because there was no alternative. The smell of fear mixed with disinfectant and recycled air, sharp and constant. People sat on deck plates, leaned against bulkheads, closed their eyes and focused on breathing through the vibration that never ceased. Somewhere deep in each hull, machines strained to keep up, pumps hammering, filters screaming as they processed far more than they had ever been designed to endure. Above the planet, the evacuation lanes burned bright with activity. Shuttles climbed and docked in relentless cycles, hulls glowing from repeated atmospheric passes. Navigation systems recalculated endlessly, adjusting for debris, for gravity fluctuations, for ships that were never where standard physics said they should be. Human vessels absorbed the chaos and bent it into flow, creating corridors of movement that looked impossible on any tactical display. External monitoring stations recorded the pace with mounting disbelief. Projections shattered one after another. The rate of extraction exceeded maximum theoretical throughput. Bottlenecks failed to form. Panic did not stall the process. Fear did not paralyze. It was as if the human fleet operated on a different set of rules, one where urgency sharpened coordination instead of destroying it. Then the shadows moved. Long-range sensors registered distortions at the edges of the system, clusters of drives flaring to life in patterns too erratic to be military and too aggressive to be accidental. Pirate flotillas surged forward, hulls scarred and mismatched, weapon ports yawning open like hungry mouths. Their crews tasted blood in the vacuum, reading the density of targets and the apparent lack of escort as an invitation. The evacuation lanes, bright and crowded, promised easy kills and richer salvage than any raid in recent memory. As the raiders closed in, weapons signatures bloomed. Power levels spiked. Targeting systems locked. The vacuum itself seemed to tense, as if anticipating the violence about to unfold. External analysts flagged imminent disaster. Civilian ships, overloaded and underarmed, should have scattered. Retreat was the only logical response. The first human ships did not flee. Instead, their silhouettes changed. Hull plates shifted with a deep, resonant groan that carried even through the silence of space. Vibrations transmitted along frames and into the bodies of those inside. Panels slid aside, retracting with deliberate slowness, revealing structures that had never appeared in any public registry. Power flows rerouted, energy drawn away from comfort systems and poured into conduits that had lain dormant since launch. Lights dimmed across civilian compartments as priorities shifted, the temperature dropping a fraction as reactors fed something else. Civilian transponders flickered, then dimmed, their signals flattening into ambiguity. To distant sensors, the human fleet seemed to blur, signatures overlapping and smearing together. Targeting solutions degraded. Pirate systems struggled to maintain locks as electronic noise blossomed outward, a controlled storm of interference that gnawed at guidance and fire control alike. Then the dormant systems awakened. Defensive arrays unfolded with mechanical grace, not the sprawling gun decks of warships, but compact, efficient instruments hidden within civilian frames. Point defense networks came alive first, tracking hundreds of incoming vectors simultaneously. Interceptors launched from recessed bays, small and fast, their drives flaring like sparks as they formed a living shield around the evacuation lanes. Energy projectors followed, precise and restrained, calibrated not for annihilation but for denial. The first pirate salvo never reached its targets. Incoming fire dissolved into blossoms of light as countermeasures met them head-on. Missiles vanished in controlled detonations. Kinetic rounds shattered against fields that rippled but held. Pirate ships pushed forward anyway, driven by momentum and disbelief, only to find their drives sputtering as targeted pulses tore through propulsion systems with surgical accuracy. Hulls ruptured. Atmospheres vented in silent plumes. Raiders spun away, crippled rather than destroyed, their crews suddenly confronted with the realization that they had misjudged their prey. Human ships did not pursue. They did not break formation. Every movement was calculated to protect the evacuation, not to maximize kills. Defensive fire adjusted constantly, prioritizing threats that drifted too close to shuttle trajectories. Interceptors repositioned with uncanny coordination, filling gaps before they could widen. The evacuation lanes remained intact, shuttles slipping through the chaos like beads on a thread. Inside the human vessels, the shift was felt immediately. The vibration changed pitch as systems engaged. The air grew colder, sharper. People gripped railings tighter, eyes wide, hearts hammering as they sensed the presence of danger beyond the hull. Fear surged, raw and undeniable, but it did not break the flow. Parents pressed children closer. Medics kept working with shaking hands that refused to stop. Engineers rerouted power again and again, sweat freezing at their temples as they fought to keep everything online. From the ground, the sky burned. Streaks of light crossed above collapsing cities as weapons fire flashed and died, distant thunder without sound. For those waiting to board, the sight was terrifying and mesmerizing, a reminder of how small they were beneath forces that could erase them in an instant. And yet the shuttles kept landing. Ramps kept lowering. Hands kept reaching down to pull others up. Across the sector, doctrines cracked. Observers watched civilian ships stand their ground against armed raiders and could not reconcile the data. These were not warships masquerading as transports. They were transports that had been built with the assumption that danger would come, and that fleeing was not an option when lives depended on holding fast. The realization spread slowly, heavy with implications. Humanity had embedded violence within mercy, not as a threat, but as a shield. The pirate attack faltered and broke, raiders scattering with crippled fleets and shattered expectations. Salvage would be minimal. Profit had turned to loss. The evacuation continued without pause, its rhythm unbroken. In the vast darkness beyond Kharos Minor, the galaxy absorbed what it was witnessing. A species that prioritized the most vulnerable with irrational consistency. A fleet that refused to abandon its mission even when attacked. Civilian ships that transformed into bastions not to conquer, but to protect. Amid collapsing gravity and predatory opportunism, humanity revealed a truth older than its presence among the stars. When pressed, when cornered, when the helpless were threatened, humans did not choose efficiency. They chose each other, and they were willing to turn the very vessels of mercy into weapons of defiance to prove it. The vacuum around the evacuation lanes shimmered with residual heat, a faint distortion where energy had been spent with careful intent. Debris drifted in slow, glittering arcs, fragments of pirate hulls still warm, still shedding vapor as internal atmospheres bled away into nothing. The light from distant stars reflected off scorched metal, turning wreckage into a field of cold embers. Through it all, the human ships held position, massive and improbably calm, their silhouettes steady against the dying gravity of Kharos Minor. What the galaxy had first mistaken for improvisation revealed itself as design. Across the human fleet, structural seams finished their transformation. Armored petals locked into place. Heat sinks glowed dull red before cooling back to gray. Weapon systems, compact and brutally efficient, cycled through readiness states with a discipline that spoke of doctrine rather than desperation. These were not armaments meant to project power across interstellar distances. They lacked the range and spectacle of imperial dreadnoughts. They existed for one purpose only: to make crossing a certain line impossible. Pirate vessels that pushed too close discovered this truth in fractions of a second. Their drives failed first, shredded by focused bursts that left hulls intact, but motionless, prisoners of their own momentum. Weapon arrays followed, neutralized by precise strikes that melted conduits and fused firing chambers into useless slag. Boarding craft vanished entirely, intercepted and erased before their occupants could comprehend that the prey had teeth. The brutality was absolute, yet restrained, violence applied like a scalpel rather than a blade. The human fleet did not advance. It did not spread out to hunt fleeing raiders. Every ship remained where it was, anchoring the evacuation lanes, maintaining overlapping fields of denial that shifted subtly as shuttles passed through. When pirate craft turned and ran, no pursuit followed. The wall did not chase those who fled. It simply remained, immovable, a boundary written in force. Inside the ships, the cost of that restraint was felt in sweat and shaking hands. Reactors groaned under sustained load, their hum deepening until it vibrated through bones and teeth. Engineers moved through cramped maintenance corridors slick with condensation, fingers numb as they rerouted power and bled off heat. Medics worked by dimmed lights, the air sharp with antiseptic and fear, monitoring heart rates that spiked with every tremor of the hull. Families clung together, whispering prayers or reciting half-remembered songs under their breath, finding rhythm in the familiar as the unknown pressed close. Every human aboard knew, in some quiet place, that the ships were fragile. Armor could fail. Shields could flicker. One miscalculation could turn a transport into a tomb. The knowledge did not breed hesitation. It sharpened focus. The wall held because every person within it believed that holding was not optional. External observers struggled to reconcile what they were witnessing. Military analysts replayed sensor feeds, slowing them down, annotating them with disbelief. The human vessels lacked the tonnage and raw output that conventional doctrine demanded for such a stand. Their formations violated established principles, prioritizing coverage over firepower, cohesion over aggression. And yet the result was undeniable. A civilian fleet, burdened with refugees and operating within a collapsing gravity well, had repelled a concentrated pirate assault without breaking its mission profile. The horror crept in slowly. Humanity had not hidden war inside mercy as a trick. There had been no attempt to deceive the galaxy. The ships had been registered as civilian because that was their primary function. They carried food, water, medicine, and people. The weapons embedded within them were not an afterthought or a contingency. They were an extension of the same impulse that drove the evacuation itself. Protecting life was not a passive act. It required teeth. As more pirate flotillas arrived and met the same fate, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every engagement ended the same way. Raiders advanced. The wall absorbed the impact. The attackers were stripped of their ability to harm and cast aside. The human fleet remained, neither expanding nor retreating, burning only when struck. The evacuation lanes never closed. On Kharos Minor, the sky glowed with distant flashes as the last great cities emptied. The air had grown thin enough to sting lungs, cold enough to crack lips and skin. Gravity lurched unpredictably, pulling bodies sideways, making every step an effort. And still the shuttles came down. Still they lifted off, heavy with life, climbing through turbulence and debris toward the waiting wall. For those watching from the ground, the human ships became more than machines. They were symbols, bright and stubborn against the dark. People pressed hands together, touched lucky charms, closed their eyes, and imagined the feel of solid decks beneath their feet. Fear remained, a constant ache, but it was joined by something else. Trust. Within the wall, human crews felt the strain deepen as time stretched on. Sleep came in fragments, stolen between alarms and system checks. Muscles cramped from constant readiness. Throats burned from recycled air. Yet morale did not fracture. Every successful shuttle docking sent a ripple of quiet satisfaction through the ships, a reminder of why they endured. Every disabled pirate hull drifting away was one less threat to the fragile lives passing through their care. The galaxy watched and learned, whether it wished to or not. Doctrines that had stood unchallenged for centuries cracked under the weight of this example. The idea that civilian and military functions must be separate collapsed. The assumption that compassion required vulnerability was exposed as a dangerous myth. Humanity demonstrated a different equation, one where mercy was not the absence of force, but its disciplined application. As the pirate threat finally dwindled, broken and scattered, the human fleet did not celebrate. There was no surge of triumph, no release of tension. Systems remained at readiness. The wall held. Shuttles continued to flow. Until the last evacuees were aboard, there would be no easing, no rest. In the cold expanse around Kharos Minor, amid the wreckage of those who had come to profit from suffering, the truth settled like frost on steel. Humanity had drawn a line in the void and dared the universe to cross it. Not for territory, not for power, but for the simple, defiant belief that no one should be left to die alone when there was still breath to spend and strength to stand. The wall breathed, patient and unyielding, and the evacuation went on. Chapter 6. The final rupture came without sound, a vast and graceful tearing that rippled through space like a held breath finally released. Kharos Minor folded in on itself as its core lost the last argument with gravity, continents shattering into incandescent ribbons, oceans lifting in ghostly arcs before vanishing into steam and light. From a distance, it looked almost gentle, a silent bloom where a world had been. The light washed across nearby hulls, pale and cold, reflecting off armor scored by battle and paint worn thin by overuse. Then the glow faded, leaving only drifting ash and a darkness that felt heavier for what it had consumed. The evacuation lanes were empty. Hours earlier, the last transports had burned hard away from the planet. Engines pushed beyond redline one final time. Their hulls groaned under impossible mass, frames bowed and protested, microfractures crawling like frost along stressed beams. Inside, people clung to restraints and to one another, bodies packed so tightly that breathing became a shared act. The air smelled of sweat, recycled oxygen, and fear slowly giving way to exhaustion. Children slept wherever gravity allowed. Fingers knotted in unfamiliar fabric. Elders stared at bulkheads with unfocused eyes, lips moving in silent counting, measuring time by heartbeats instead of clocks. No evacuation ship fell behind. Navigation systems screamed warnings that were acknowledged and ignored. Structural integrity monitors lit up in cascading failures that crews logged with grim efficiency. Engineers fed damaged systems just enough power to keep them alive, siphoning energy from everywhere else. Lights dimmed to twilight levels. Non-essential systems went dark. The ships endured, not because they were strong, but because they were refused permission to fail. Behind them, the wall held until there was nothing left to guard. The human fleet maintained formation long after the last shuttle cleared the gravity well, sensors sweeping empty space where lives had passed moments before. Only when confirmation rippled through every channel that no stragglers remained did the ships begin to withdraw. Defensive systems powered down with reluctant clicks and sighs, heat radiating away in visible waves. Interceptors returned to their bays, scorched and scarred, some limping, all accounted for. Not a single human vessel had been lost. 300 million lives crossed the stars inside, hulls never meant to carry such weight. The realization struck observers with a force no weapon could match. The numbers alone were staggering, a population written off as an acceptable loss now scattered across safe systems, alive, frightened, and breathing. But it was the method that unsettled the galaxy. Humanity had accomplished the impossible without escalation, without conquest, without sacrificing those it sought to save. It had done so by refusing a choice the universe considered reasonable. In the aftermath, the Perseid coalition convened in chambers designed for certainty. Data flowed in steady streams, sensor logs and engagement analyses filling vast displays. Models were recompiled. Assumptions were tested and discarded. Variables that had never been quantified pressed for inclusion. Stubbornness resisted clean definition. Sacrifice refused to be normalized. Protective violence, applied with restraint rather than hunger, defied predictive curves. The coalition amended its projections anyway. New annotations appeared in once sterile archives. Notes appended with careful phrasing that betrayed unease. Evacuation viability could no longer be calculated purely in terms of material cost. Civilian classification no longer implied defenselessness. Human presence introduced non-linear outcomes. Systems previously deemed terminal were re-examined, their fates less certain now that an example existed of what refusal could achieve. Across the galaxy, reactions unfolded in quieter spaces. Merchant guilds adjusted insurance tables, recalibrating risk where human lifeboats might appear. Border empires hesitated before sealing worlds deemed inefficient, haunted by the thought of crowded transports slipping through with walls of fire around them. Pirate clans whispered of the evacuation lanes of Kharos Minor with something like reverence, tales of prey that did not run and mercy that struck back. Some laughed it off. Others quietly chose different hunting grounds. On the human ships, the victory felt nothing like triumph. Relief came first, heavy and disorienting. People slumped where they stood, muscles giving out now that they were no longer needed. Tears ran unchecked, carving clean lines through grime. Medics moved through the press of bodies, hands gentle, voices low, cataloging injuries and shock. Engineers leaned against bulkheads, eyes closed, feeling the vibration of engines that still held together despite everything. Somewhere in the mass, someone laughed once, a sharp, incredulous sound, and then sobbed until sleep claimed them. The rescued carried Kharos Minor with them. Memories clung like dust, the taste of thinning air, the sound of alarms fading into silence, the image of a sky tearing itself apart. People spoke of neighbors lost and found, of hands that had pulled them forward, of strangers who had shared water and warmth without question. Grief traveled alongside gratitude, inseparable and unresolved. Survival did not erase loss. It honored it by continuing. As the fleet dispersed, delivering its living cargo to worlds that had never expected to receive them, the human ships returned to quieter roles. Hull plates sealed back into civilian lines. Weapons folded away, systems entering dormancy once more. To casual sensors, they looked like what they had always claimed to be. Transports, lifeboats, vessels of passage. The galaxy would never see them the same way again. The lesson of Kharos Minor spread not through proclamations, but through silence and recalculation. A truth settled into the collective understanding of spacefaring civilizations, uncomfortable and undeniable. Humanity did not send warships to save the helpless. Warships implied intent to dominate, to project will outward. Humans sent lifeboats instead, and wrapped them in just enough fire to ensure that compassion was not an invitation to be devoured. In a universe that prized efficiency and survival of the calculable, humanity introduced something profoundly dangerous. The refusal to abandon anyone. The willingness to suffer damage, to risk annihilation, to embed war inside mercy and call it protection. Not as deception, not as exception, as doctrine. Long after the debris of Kharos Minor cooled and drifted into obscurity, the echoes of that refusal remained. They lived on in amended models and wary glances, in crowded refugee districts and rebuilt lives, in the quiet knowledge that somewhere among the stars, there existed a species that would come for you in creaking hulls and overburdened engines, regardless of the math. The universe learned that day that empathy, when defended, could be the most terrifying force of all.